Okay, so now that you've gotten to know BCSP and the Philippine Biodiversity Symposium, we can jump right into the first plenary talk for the day, focusing on the forest rangers, our modern-day heroes in the front lines. And joining us all the way from Mexico is our distinguished keynote speaker. And it is my honor and pleasure to introduce him. Our speaker is a physician, medical anthropologist, and writer. He is senior lecturer at the University of the Philippine Diliman's Department of Anthropology, research fellow at the Ateneo de Manila University's Development Studies Program, and also honorary fellow at Hong Kong University Center for Criminology. He is joining us from Mexico City. We are approximately 11 hours ahead of Mexico City, where he is now currently based. And he is doing comparative research on COVID-19 responses and language studies at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. Our speaker is also a medical doctor. He obtained his medical and master's degrees, MSc in medical anthropology, from the UP College of Medicine, and his PhD in anthropology from the University of Amsterdam. He is also a recipient of the Palanca Award for Essay. Dr. Lasco's research projects have yielded over 40 journal articles and book chapters, including about the COVID-19 pandemic, the drug wars in the Philippines and Asia, the meanings and materialities of human stature in the Philippines, among other scholarly topics. Beyond his work in medical anthropology and public health, he is also involved in environmental and civic initiatives. Everyone, please help me in welcoming Dr. Gideon Lasco. Morning, Dr. Gideon Lasco, and welcome to the 29th Philippine Biodiversity Symposium.
Thank you, Sir Jason, and thank you to everyone for inviting me to join you today.
Welcome po, Sir Gideon, and we're very, very excited and is looking forward to hearing your talk. So without further delay po, I'm giving the floor to Dr. Gideon Lasco.
Thank you, Dr. Jason, and of course, thank you to the Biodiversity Conservation Society of the Philippines. I believe that to be here today and to join you is to represent a group of people, a group of individuals who has been doing so much important work in our conservation, and yet we need more to give them more visibility and to give them a seat in the table in terms of our conservation response. And I am referring to none other than the Bantay Gubat in our country. We call them forest guards, guardia monte, Bantay lasang. There are many work terms to refer to Bantay Gubat, but most of them are volunteers. There are also forest rangers within the DNR, and I will talk about the dynamics between the employed guards and the volunteer guards later. But I was interested. I'm here to share with you some of the things that I found, some of the things that I found out and learned when talking to them in the course of a one-year research from 2019 to 2020. Sige, next slide. So the background for this research is, next slide, is of course, we can frame this academically by looking at the global literature that has found that surprisingly there's very little in terms of accounting for the very local politics of conservation, the very local people who are in what we can call the environmental front lines. So even before, long before the pandemic, long before the environmental crisis that we are talking about today, we can see that medyo na-neglect itong mga kasama natin sa environmental work ng mga Bantay Gubat. Next slide. And I was inspired. So Dr. Jason introduced me. Mostly the credentials that I have are mostly in the health sector because I'm basically a medical anthropologist and I do work around health systems reform, healthcare research. So, one of the researches that I did was about hypertension. So napakalayo sa forest guards, di ba? But bear with me, I will explain to you why I was inspired to look at forest guards. So when we were doing this research on hypertension in Quezon and Valenzuela City, palagi namin kasama yung mga BHW, barangay health workers. They were accompanying us and they were doing so much. But as a doctor, I never encountered BHWs a lot in terms of medical school. I didn't even know that they existed in a way that's very elaborate. Their roles, they do a lot of things at the barangay level. And then we decided to do a sub-study looking at community health workers in the Philippines, or barangay health workers in the Philippines. And then I realized this is very much similar to forest guards. Basically, the barangay health workers are to the healthcare system as forest guards are to the environment. They're part of conservation in the same way that BHWs are part of the healthcare system, and yet they're not well represented. And it might be good to explore what they are, who they are, what they do, what their motivations are, to take them seriously, in other words. Next slide. But aside from my own health research, and aside from my willingness to cross over into environmental research, I believe that these boundaries really don't matter too much, and we should not be, ano lang ako, I'm a medical anthropologist, hindi ko kaya yung environmental na yan. I will not touch that. Aside from me encouraging everyone to feel free to basically interact and engage with different sectors, to do interdisciplinary work and cross-disciplinary work, I'm also inspired by the fact that I grew up in Mount Makiling. So my father was UP College of Forestry faculty, and we grew up with forest rangers in Makiling, including Jojo Malinaw, who was killed in the line of duty. And until now, I have to pay tribute to Jojo Malinaw and so many of these forest guards, Bantay Gubat, who have been killed and injured in the line of duty. I am doing this for them in many ways. That they're in my mind when I did this, and I proposed this research to Forest Foundation Philippines. Next slide. So we can also look at history, of course, in terms of how, in fact, even during the Spanish period, there have been people who have been recruited by colonial governments to be part of environmental work or to be involved in forest governance, even though as our environmental social scientists, as our environmental historians point out, the roles of these environmental frontliners before was mostly to implement the imperatives of the colonial government, and they were very extractive at the time. They were actually encouraging forest deforestation and logging, and these were guards to facilitate this. But somehow, eventually, there was a realization that we need to start protecting our forests. So the forest guard or their forerunners became involved also in somehow protecting them, and this was formalized in the 1970s, 1980s, and even early 90s, when there was more explicit discussion of the roles of forest guard, the PAMBI system also. So they were trying to recognize partnerships with the community. So all of these figured in the ways in which forest guards became increasingly involved in the forest governance discourse in the country. Next slide. So this is a qualitative research. We basically interviewed forest guards all over the country, mostly in the Sierra Madre and also Bukidnon. So Mount Kitanglad Range, Kalatungan Range, and also Mount Makiling. We interviewed the rangers under UP Los Baños. And we also went to Bulacan, in the Ipo area, to talk to some of these groups. But we'll be anonymizing some of them. In fact, in the chapter that I wrote for the Forest Foundation Philippines, to protect their identities, they're not necessarily named na dito galing sa ganitong lugar to mga Bantay Gubat na to. And we analyze them thematically. We look at the transcripts of these discussions and looked at what are the themes that emerged most strongly. And then yun yung nilagay natin sa chapter. And I will be sharing with you some of the findings of this qualitative research in a short while. Okay, next slide. So these are my research assistants, Jackie Mendoza and Prince Aldama of UP Los Baños. So I acknowledge them as involved in this. Some of the parts were interviewed in different languages. We had to translate them, of course. Sige, next slide. So now for the findings. Next slide. So the first question that we were very interested in was to ask, what are the motivations of being a forest guard? We tend to assume, especially among marginalized populations, that people are driven only by financial need. But as anthropologists, but as social scientists, we don't want to make any assumptions, let alone such an assumption that views marginalized communities in a very narrow way. So we wanted to explore what are your motivations. And surprisingly, many of them actually articulated a deep love for the forests. So I was doing FGDs, and many of you, I know that I am joining an audience, joining a group, a community of people who have worked in these areas a lot. So you're familiar with, you've met, I'm sure many of you have met Bantay Gubat all over the country. Mga batak, these are hardened men mostly, but also women who have been working in their communities for so long. But to my surprise, some of them teared up. Parang naluha yung mga iba sa kanila when you asked them, parang bakit nyo ginagawa to? So I was really amazed at how they articulated their love for mountains, their love for the forest. So ito yung mga ibang sinabi nila na, mahal namin itong bundok, God created this for us, this was been in our community for generations, and that's why we're being Bantay Gubat. They also speak of it as health, parang it's a healthy pursuit, maganda sa katawan yung pagiging Bantay Gubat. But what really struck me is this expression of affection for the environment. Next slide. Now, I want to make a distinction between volunteer guards. So ito yung mga minsan bahagi ng NGO, minsan bahagi ng isang organization, or even under an LGU, but they're not really under DNR. So there's a kind of informal or indirect relationship. So iba yun, parang I will refer to them as volunteer forest guards. But there are also regular guards who are under the employ of government agencies, for example, DNR or UP Los Baños. So alam naman natin yung mga roles nila. They mostly do weekly patrols. Yung iba, once or twice a month. They also, minsan din, sabi nila na, forest guard, ranger ako sa DNR, pero sa totoo lang, hindi yun yung ginagawa ko. Yun lang yung title ko para magkaroon ng item, pero sa totoo lang, secretary ako dito sa office namin. So there are, within the bureaucracy, being called a forest ranger doesn't mean that you're doing the kind of work that we think forest rangers do. Sige, next slide. But they also participate in these special events, pag may mga occasions, adlaw ng Kitanglad, so Kitanglad Day, they're all there. There are special projects. And many of these NGO-based volunteers actually look forward more to these special projects kasi dito sila nakakakuha ng mga allowance or honorarium. For example, tree planting, monitoring of wildlife, among others. However, especially in areas where there are different kinds of NGOs operating within the same area, pwede rin maging friction itong mga projects na to. Kasi sometimes it's the prerogative of the DNR who to designate as Bantay Gubat for this project. So nagkakaroon ng mga frictions. Another thing that emerged very prominently is that many forest guards are actually involved also in firefighting and yung mga forest fires. They respond as well. And they're afraid of it. But at the same time, sila yung taga doon, especially the volunteers who live in the mountain. So these are ad hoc activities that people do in the course of their work as Bantay Gubat. Next slide. So aside from looking at first is we look at their motivations, and I emphasize they love them, the affection as a motivation. Syempre, andun din yung financial motivation because they also get something out of it financially. But I just highlighted yung affection as a motivation, and then we talk about their roles, and then yung relationships also we explored. And we found out how very challenging it has been for them in terms of negotiating different relationships. So, pakikisama sa barangay, for example, pakikisama sa mayor, pakikisama sa military or police because sometimes there are checkpoints that they have to be parang engaged in also, they have to be involved. So medyo naiipit yung mga ibang guards. And just like Jojo Malinaw, who was killed and in the line of duty, sometimes they also have to, more than once I heard from the forest guards that they have to attest to illegal activities. And dito sila naiipit rin kasi in terms of legal representation, some of them are afraid, and the threats that they get from this litigation, from this having to testify to the court. Sige. Next. And we also explored qualities that they think they should have as forest guards. So of course, physical fitness is there, creativity, self-sufficiency, independence, but very important yung pakikisama and pakikitungo sa tao, which is, we can call it like a local diplomacy because many of them are part of indigenous communities, so kailangan nilang pakiusapan yung sarili nilang mga kababayan, sarili nilang mga kasama sa komunidad to implement what's asked of them. So pakikisama and pakikitungo sa tao are very important. Next. Now, the most important, I guess we're all interested in looking at what do they need and what do they think they need. How can we work with forest guards in a way to advance forest conservation and biodiversity conservation? But how do we also look at forest conservation in a way that also advances the welfare of Bantay Gubat and their families? So ang kanilang nabanggit would be protection. Many of them are really concerned in terms of, syempre alam naman natin yung mga pangangailangan, higher pay, equipment, and so on. But beyond that, they're very concerned with insurance. Halimbawa, pag ba sila nagkasakit or pag ba sila nasugatan, meron ba silang insurance? Meron ba silang matakbuhan na hospital? So it's not necessarily financial. There's also concern about non-monetary needs. And I show this picture of this sad story, another tragedy that has become so familiar to us, of another ranger getting killed in Palawan. Syempre, wherever you are around the country, as a Bantay Gubat, nababalitaan mo rin itong mga ganitong pangyayari. At syempre, mas lalo ka nababahala sa sarili mo dahil sa mga ganitong mga balita. So they take news like this seriously, and it also affects their state of mind. It also affects their sense of the worthiness of what they do. Sige, next slide. Ito na, I mentioned this na it's actually not so much the financial need, although of course it is, but there's some other benefits that they are really looking forward to. Health insurance, life insurance, all kinds of basically assurances from people that they are being taken care of. They also feel that they're understaffed, and this goes both for the forest rangers that are employed and also the volunteers. Feeling nila kulang na kulang sila. So having additional people to join them would mean a lot for the Bantay Gubat. Next slide. Ito pa, yung sinabi sa amin na they hope to get a bonus, especially if they go, because we know that this is very informal. We know that how it works is very informal. It's not like they have an office. But when people need them, pag may apoy, they have to respond, and they don't necessarily get compensated for the service that they do. So they're looking for what they call hazard fee or hazard pay or whatever. This is part of the things that they're really looking for. Next. Sige, before I talk about these views of environmental issues, I'd like to also mention that some of them are also looking for recognition, which is parang merong nagkwento sa akin na Bantay Gubat na sobrang saya daw niya na yung governor binisita sila and nagpasalamat. So even these things, we cannot dismiss them as mere symbolic. Of course, we'd like these tokens of appreciation to be accompanied by more substantive support. But at the same time, even recognition really matters, diba? Do we really talk about forest guards the way we talk about doctors, for example, diba? So I think that para naman sa atin lahat, diba? Parang why we do the things we do, it's not just about the monetary compensation, but also the recognition that what we're doing is valuable. And many of them don't feel that they're being valued in that sense. So another interesting thing that we did in our interviews was to explore what they think about environmental issues. Most of the time, we think of barangay health workers, forest guards as implementers of policy. But we thought that we'd also look at them as experts in policy making. We'd also look at them in terms of what they think should be done. So these are just snippets. This is not really the main objective of the research, but we still gleaned some issues, some insights. The forest can heal itself. All we need is to protect it. So yung ibang mga sinasabi nila actually resonate with what scientists also say about conservation. They're concerned about sustainability. What happens next year pag tapos na yung project? So these are the things that they ask. Next slide. Okay, so again, to summarize, I basically talk about the forest guards' roles, their motivations, the relationships, the qualities, the needs and aspirations that they have, and some of their views on the environment. So next slide. So itong discussion is more of still looking at on the findings, but more of analyzing them and comparing them with the literature. So what I found striking in these conversations with Bantay Gubat is that being a Bantay Gubat is not just a job, it's also a part of sense of identity. It's also a sense of belonging to a group. So yung mga interviews namin, makikita namin, naka-uniform pa sila. They're very proud of their uniforms. Pare-pareho sila nasuot na t-shirt. They really identify with a group and feel that they belong to parang barkadahan, but something that has purpose. So they really feel proud of being Bantay Gubat. And I would propose na this might explain why they stick to the role, because it's parang naging kasama, naging pamilya na sila with the other Bantay Gubat. So identity and belonging really emerged as a strong, for me, a strong theme based on our conversations. Next slide. However, I also feel that this kind of group belonging can be in friction with forest governance, because sometimes there's some friction between different groups of Bantay Gubat. And I'm sure many of you who have worked in these areas know more than me in terms of how these conflicts are resolved, how these frictions are resolved. But being part of a group means that there can be some kind of friction among different groups of Bantay Gubat, among the forest rangers of the DNR and the volunteer guards that are under an organization. So I can see in the chat, people are pointing out na magkaiba yung forest rangers at deputized rangers, and that's really true. So I refer to deputized rangers as volunteer rangers in this presentation, and medyo magkaiba talaga yung kanilang mga concerns. So another thing that I saw is that in some groups, they regard being Bantay Gubat as a lifelong position. So many of them hold on to that until they're very old. And they even see it as hereditary. So feeling nila pwede nilang ipamana sa mga anak nila yung pagiging Bantay Gubat. And in a way, that's good because it ensures continuity, but it also alienates some people within the same community na parang feeling nila, ito yung mga pamilya doon or sila yon, hindi kami kasama. So meron mga ganong issues. And this is just an exploratory study, so I was not really able to probe deeper into many of these themes, but I felt that it was nice to see them and to articulate them in a way that point to future research. Next slide. Local relationships matter. So I already mentioned it earlier. And one of the biggest tensions within relationships that I saw was between their own indigenous communities, especially among the indigenous guards, and the DNR. Kasi minsan magkaiba yung kanilang aspirations. Some anthropologists like Padma Pani Perez wrote about this, how we cannot romanticize indigenous people as noble green savages. And I also see that playing out in the tension between local belonging to the community versus belonging to the environmental governance structure. Sige. Next slide. They also are repositories of indigenous knowledge, many of these volunteer guards. Some of them, for example, in Sierra Madre, talk about the different root crops that they know. So I think that all of these point to the fact that instead of just looking at Bantay Gubat as implementers of forest policy, we should also look at them as resources for knowledge and actually experts in the forest. So this is just to give you one thing that I learned, is that they talk about so many root crops in the Sierra Madre, for instance, and even the affinity of species to each other. Meron silang mga knowledge about, they have horticultural knowledge that maybe we haven't discovered yet, or maybe it's lying there waiting to be discovered. Sige, next slide. And in this slide, I just compared what I found with the literature that in fact also affirms that many of these community members have a lot of knowledge that can facilitate and help in environmental conservation. The Muyong system, for example, in Ifugao, and then the view of ecological knowledge from community members. My examples are mostly around forests, but I know that there's a parallel with coastal areas as well. Meron din mga bantay dagat, and even I'm sure the ecological knowledge in that is also equally interesting. I'm sure maybe Cynthia can talk about it, or some others can share what they've learned. But this is just floating ideas for future work. Next slide. And then sustainability was really a concern in two ways. Number one is the sustainability of their organization. Kasi nga many of them depend on projects. Halimbawa, merong monitoring of wildlife. So I think they got smartphones or tablets to do it. But they're concerned what happens next. And sometimes it's also politics driven. There's some governors, congressmen who want to support the Bantay Gubat. They will give money, but it's not guaranteed. It's not an institutional support. It's political support. So it can be temporary, and they're concerned about that. But in a longer term sense, sustainability was also a concern among the guards, because especially the volunteer guards, because many of them are aging. I've seen a group of Bantay Gubat where the average age of the Bantay Gubat was 50. And they're saying, I'm too tired, di ko na nga kaya maglakad eh. And they're forest guards. And they want to hold on to their position, which is understandable, but they're also having a hard time recruiting young people to join their ranks. So these are some of the things that I think we should look at if we want to look at forest guards and tap them in maximize their potential in governance. We have to look at how we can sustain the forest guards. And the context here, of course, is many people are leaving the rural areas for the cities. So it's not just forest guards that are having this problem. It's a sociological phenomenon of people leaving the rural areas. Okay, next slide. Ito, parang I said 50s and older, etc. Okay, next slide. So in conclusion, and this is really something very preliminary and tentative, it's very much needful of follow-up and collective sharing of experiences. What I found out was a very small and very limited sample of the thousands of forest guards around the country, the hundreds of sites. And I just look at mountainous areas, partly because I love mountain climbing as well. So I'm really interested, but at the same time, of course, I have to focus on one topic, but I'm sure there's so many other, the mangroves, the watersheds, they have their own concerns. So in conclusion, I think that definitely my research has laid down the case that we need to really include forest guards in thinking about forest governance, not just as implementors, but as sources of knowledge, not just as people to be deputized, but people to be listened to. And we can work with them. They have this sense of identity and belonging that we can mobilize. They have some knowledge that we can learn from as well. So let me reiterate before I end this presentation that this is really dedicated to all these Bantay Gubat who are doing amazing work. Many of them have been killed and injured in the line of duty. So let's keep them in mind as we continue this important work of biodiversity conservation. Thank you and have a good day, everyone.
Okay, so let's begin with the first question I have here. One from Mr. Paulo Pagaduan of WWF. How will the proposed Environmental Protection and Enforcement Bureau of the DNR, I believe this is a new bureau that is being developed, how will the new bureau help the Bantay Gubats? The drafts seem to only include the DNR forest rangers and not the volunteer BGs. Would you like to answer, Dr. Lasco?
Yes, actually, during the time that I was doing, and thank you, Paolo, for that, for raising that question. While we were doing the interviews, this was still being proposed. The status was people were talking about this, and then yung i-arm ba daw sila. Some of the Bantay Gubat were saying that they welcome having firearms. Others were hesitant, sabi nila that might just put them in danger. So some of them welcome this proposal because of they feel that they're really threatened, they have to act. But others feel that it might just jeopardize them even more. So I think that this is something, I don't think that they have been consulted, at least consulted thoroughly in terms of this proposal. That's why moving forward, I do think that they should be involved because they do exist as part of the environmental governance structure in many parks, in many protected areas. So this proposal should not be done or should not be completed without really taking into account the Bantay Gubat. And Paolo also asked where we can get the copy of the study. It's available, open access. I will share with you the link to the chapter. So it's freely accessible to everyone. And of course, if you have questions about the study, I'm more than happy to answer them. Thank you.
Follow-up question from my end. Do you think inserting a section on engaging and the benefits for deputized volunteer Bantay Gubat be an important part of the new bureau? Do you think that should be in the new structure of the new bureau?
Well, I think that at a symbolic level, definitely some kind of representation can mean a lot. There are organized Bantay Gubat, for example, Nakitang Lifeguard volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
So having at least someone, at the minimum, I think that having someone who will represent the Bantay Gubat will be important. But in terms of how to operationalize this, I'm really not an expert in that. I think we have people who are far better to answer, in a far better position to answer the nuances of forest governance. But I think the work that I did and future work that will be similar to mine can help inform these decisions and policies.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Lasco. We have another question here, this time from Paul Rigor. Hi, Doc Gideon. Thank you very much for an amazing talk. I would like to ask how will we protect our rangers and other environmental defenders if there are alleged protectors or backers of those people who do illegal things, who belong to the government ranks? Is this a problem of legislation or implementation? Thank you.
I think it's a problem of local governance because some of the forest rangers that I talked to really felt empowered because they have sabi nila, meron kaming mayor na sobrang supportive na parang we really go after this illegal logging. And they feel that if they have local governance behind them, it means so much to them. And iba yung pakiramdam ng mga ganong nakausap namin and those who feel na sila yung naiipit because they feel na ito yung kanilang mandate and yet they don't feel supported by the local. So very important yung mga local officials in this. And like I said earlier, some of the things are really hard to think about, diba? Like yung plantilla, or how do we even mobilize this? Barangay health workers are having the same issue. They're also technically not part of the local allowance lang din sila. So very complicated, but I believe that there are some things that are simple and can be done immediately. For example, health insurance. Diba? Nasa universal healthcare naman talaga na kasama naman dapat lahat. So having that guarantee of protection can mean so much to them. So there are difficult debates around this, but there are also things that I think are easy to do and should be done right away.
Right. Well, I really do agree, Dr. Lasco. I really like how you framed then yung mga incentives that the forest guards are getting. On one hand, you have yung material incentives, which is basically yung mga allowances and then fees. But then on the other hand, you have these non-material incentives like pride, getting recognized by peers in the community. And as you've mentioned just a while ago, yung affirmation then from the local government officials. So indeed, these are, shall we say, nutriments to sustaining yung motivation and interest ng mga forest guards natin. And with respect to again, yung material rewards, no incentives. We have here a comment/question from our friend Errol Gatumbato. Hi, Doc. Will you also include in your recommendation the possible upgrading of salary and incentive system of the DNR forest guards? I believe these are both the forest rangers and the deputized Bantay forest guards. Thank you. Nice information presentation. And that's again from Errol, former park superintendent of MKNP, Mount Canlaon Natural Park.
Thank you, Sir Errol. And of course, Mount Canlaon is one of the mountains that I have climbed in Negros. And very interesting yung system sa Mount Canlaon, di ba? Ng pag-implement ng the ecotourism part. So I mentioned it also in my study, how some of the guards are, yung iba nag-guide din. So may mga ganun dynamics as well. But in terms of Sir Errol's question about the parang ano yung recommendation should be upgraded, definitely
Upgrading.
I think that it's a matter of prioritization. I don't think we're a poor country. I think that we can allocate if we prioritize. I also think that aside from money, what would mean so much for the forest guards is number one, health insurance, education for their children, transportation, benefits, and even in death insurance, they worry about what if they die, who will pay for their burial. So all of these things matter, and I think ito yung madaling ma-implement na kaagad.
Right. Yeah. So giving premium dun sa service na binibigay nila, no? I think this is one of the advocacies of the paper, valuing the service that the forest guard performs, no, as a legit service to the country. Okay, we have another from an anonymous attendee. Great talk, Dr. Lasco. I might have missed this, but is there a move to actually institutionalize these Bantay Gubat positions? In terms of sustainability, perhaps it would be a good thing for the position not to be considered on a volunteer basis, but actual positions plantilla. It might also encourage the younger generation to be Bantay Gubats. Sir?
It's a very good point to raise. I think some congressmen have proposed some kind of legislation to formalize Bantay Gubat. But yung mga iba na kausap ko rin, ng mga PASU, mga PAMBI, they're also worried about pag daw na-institutionalize, it might even make it more politically. Kasi meron mga ibang Bantay Gubat na parang, sabi ng mayor, gawing Bantay Gubat to. And then they became against the wishes of the Bantay Gubat. Yung nirecommend ng mayor na gawing Bantay Gubat became part of their group. So meron ganun mga kwento-kwento rin. So if this is done, I think that it's very important to do it in a way that ensures some kind of transparency in the process, and it must be insulated from this local politics. Kasi alam naman natin na sa mga BHWs, kung sino yung barangay captain, siya yung mag-a-appoint ng BHW. Sometimes BHWs who have been around for 30 years will get removed because nag-iba yung barangay captain. And that can happen with this Bantay Gubat as well.
Right, no? So basically yung mga threats din ng patronage politics, no? I can share to that mga threats din, no? Okay, thank you, Dr. Lasco. We have another question from Nelson Quaresma of Coastline Inc., a local NGO engaged in research and a member of PAMBI Mount Malindang. How can we get in touch with your office, to get some references for providing capacity building of our forest guards?
Well, I don't have an office, actually. I'm an independent researcher who did this research para to help inform forest governance, to help inform policymakers. But I really hope that your question can be answered by, I mean, if this does not exist, then you've pointed out, Sir Nelson, to another problem, another challenge, because it should be done at the very least by, I think the DNR should have some service to provide capacity building of forest guards. If it doesn't exist, then you have just pointed out something that should be taken note of.
Yeah, so basically shout out then sa mga DNR peers natin. I think there's a increasing demand, no, to look at our forest guarding system, no, both yung plantilla positions as pointed out by Sir Errol, and also yung mga deputized, ano. It's true, they're still getting minimal fees, no, voluntary fees. And I think it's high time, no, given itong increasing pressures to our natural resources, no, global climate changes, zoonotic diseases, for our new government, the DNR, to improve its forest governance through the forest guarding system. Okay, so from Cebu, we also have, or going to Davao City, from Cebu, we have someone from EG Foundation, a dear friend also, Mr. Joshua Donato. Reports of forest guards on forest and wildlife violation nowadays are very important for proper law enforcement and appropriate legal actions. However, after the guards, no, submitted the report to several concerned agencies, no, with NGO interventions, slow or no response is done. How can we help them on these particular issues?
Thank you, Sir Joshua, for raising that, because the forest guards we talked to, ito yung kanilang number one frustration. Na ito nga, kami nagsusumbong, we put ourselves in the line of fire by reporting this, and then there's no action. And they really feel demoralized. I think that one way for us to be able to help forest guards feel that what they report are responded to is really to involve civil society in publicizing whatever needs to be done. Because minsan pag sa kanila lang, and then within the agency they report to, nothing happens. But if something gets publicized, ang bilis ng response. Because at the local level, it's really more of ano ba yung uunahin, ano ba yung gusto ng mayor. So if there's somehow local demand for action on issues that forest guards discover or find out, then it will help facilitate the process. What I really found was sobrang importante ng local government support. But the local government doesn't exist in a vacuum. If the local government officials feel that there's demand for acting a certain way, then it can encourage them to act on that direction. So mahalaga rin talaga to involve yung local communities and the local citizenry in making, and in a way, we cannot really count on that because forest guards don't even exist in people's imagination. So one other thing we can do is really to make them visible in the public. Na we have a group of people in the country, mga Bantay Gubat, and they're doing important work. We need to give them more visibility.
True, no? And then make people realize that, as you mentioned, Dr. Lasco, no? It doesn't exist in forest guarding. It doesn't exist as maybe a legitimate job, no? Sa minds ng mga tao, no? And if I may share, when I did this talk with a group of students, and I asked them who wants to be a doctor, no? Several raised their hands, who wants to be a engineer, etc. And then eventually, when I asked them who wants to be a forest guard, no, so crickets lang ang maririnig mo, no. So the kids don't really see forest guarding because it doesn't exist as a job option. And again, that's very important, no. Joshua, I hope you'll find that very helpful, no, visibility of forest guards, and other forms of campaigns, no, that pressure our agencies to act, no, especially if the public is waiting or looking for responses from them. Okay, we still have a few more. I hope you're still okay to entertain more questions, Dr. Lasco. We have here from a comment from Peter Widman of Kadalo Foundation. In Palawan, recruiting poachers, loggers as forest rangers work well under certain conditions. work with the cockatoo in most locations, but this needs monitoring and evaluation on a regular basis, though. So basically, changing lifestyles and attitude among poachers and loggers by hiring them as defenders of the forest instead. Would you like to comment on this, Sir Gideon?
Yes, there's a very good point also that these forest guards don't exist in a vacuum. They are there in a community where they can easily be tempted to pursue other activities. So if we don't sustain supporting them in the same way that they can be recruited to be forest rangers, pwede ring other way around yung mangyari. That they can also turn to poaching, they can also turn to logging. So very understandable that they operate within an economic context also. So we really need to back forest guard support by really supporting the communities where they live in. Otherwise, it will not be sustainable. It will have to be part of. So right now, what we're doing is we're really singling out forest guards. Very important to do this, but at the same time, we really need to frame this as a part of a broader intervention in supporting communities where they live in. Kasi if you support the forest guards and you don't empower their communities, it will only also cause jealousy and envy among the community na bakit ang laki ng sweldo nitong forest guard na to samantalang kaming mga BHW walang-wala. It has to be a comprehensive effort to support communities.
Right, yes. And there's I think I related a question here from David Kimpo, but I guess you've answered it already, regarding sustainability. So if I may summarize, empowerment of the communities, and increasing their sense of ownership of the project. So I think we're down to our last question from Ruben Gieb. Can you describe the interaction process when they intercept unregulated activities with the DNR officials and law enforcers? Okay, does that make sense po?
Well, yung mga ibang regular guards, they tell us that in the checkpoints, they're required to be there. So there always has to be a representative from DNR, and they're the ones being sent to that. Ngayon, yun naman mga volunteers, they are very clear that they don't really have a mandate to enforce. So they're only more for monitoring and reporting, which is why they really rely on action from the DNR or local government, because it's really more to notify and to document. Yun lang yung kanilang role. And they get very scared because they don't really have the power to do anything. They don't have any firepower. And iba sa kanila gusto ng firearms, but it's very controversial among them. Some want it, some don't. Many are scared nga na it will just make them more targeted. So in terms of the volunteers, yun yung dynamics. They're really more to report. And sometimes they say, hindi naman namin nakikita yung mga kami lang yung nito, hindi naman namin nakikita yung mga rangers. So I think that it really has to be a structure in which people see that everyone's doing their part. And napaka-encouraging nito sa mga volunteers if they see that people are acting as well. So, yun.
Right. Thank you very much. When you said yung issue din sa firearms, this is practically an experience din ng mga volunteer forest guards in Mount Apo, where having firearms is not an option because of the insurgency issues then. So this puts their lives at risk. So this is a very enlightening and very productive session. I'm sure everyone is very appreciative, has learned a lot. There are a few more questions and clarifications, but again, I'm sure Dr. Gideon Lasco would be happy to interact with you through email. You have his email address. Just send him a message regarding a specific questions or comments. There's a comment here about the bandanas ruling. That's an exciting potential also for sustainability chances for our forest guarding program if the local government unit would take on subsidizing itong forest guarding. So yes, again, of course, we have to end this, and perhaps sharing my own takeaway can be one way to wrap this up. No, earlier, Dr. Lasco mentioned about you have the barangay health workers taking care, our frontliners, for human health system, and maybe we can also frame our forest guards as being the frontliners for taking care of our environmental health system, which benefits everyone. So perhaps by framing it that way, we can also give a premium and importance to the very important work that they are doing. So, so that brings us to the end of our day 2 morning plenary. That would also give you ample time to have your health break. And again, on behalf of everyone, the Biodiversity Conservation Society of the Philippines, our audience and our partners, thank you, Dr. Gideon Lasco, and have a good and restful night in Mexico.
Thank you, Sir Jason, and thank you, everyone. This has been a great conversation, and let's continue this work. You can reach me, and let's continue working on this. Mabuhay ang mga bantay gubat natin.
Mabuhay po sila at mabuhay din po kayo.